In this episode, we take a look at the Godox VL300 LED light. Godox VL300 is a COB LED light. That means it has a point source and it has a Bowens mount, so you can put a variety of different reflectors or modifiers on the front of the light to change it from hard light all the way to soft light. And its main competitor is probably seen as the Aputure C300 Mark II. So first, let's go ahead and talk about the differences between the two, and then we'll get a little bit more into the details. So here we go. The output from the two, the Aputure 300D Mark II and the VL300, are very similar, with the Godox having a little bit of an edge. When you put on the reflector, it has a substantial edge as a floodlight with a 55-degree beam angle, roughly. They didn't tell me exactly what the beam angle is. It puts out a lot more light than the C300 Mark II. Now, as soon as you put something like the softbox on, they pretty much even out. So you're getting about the same amount of light. And to be fair, that's a lot of light. So you don't generally need this much light if you're just doing talking head, just so everyone's aware. In those cases, you could probably go with the smaller lights. But if you're looking for an all-in-one light that can do just about everything for most of your video needs, then this is going to be able to do talking heads plus light up large spaces as well. Probably the biggest difference that most people are going to feel is the price difference between the two. So the VL300 comes in at $749 at the time of this review, and the C300 Mark II comes in at $1,099. So pretty big difference in price. Color quality definitely goes to the Aputure on this one on a couple of different fronts. Number one, there is a little bit more magenta in the Godox. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that LED lights will turn more green over time as they're used, but the color correction index came in at 0.4 green, so almost a half green gel to get it balanced back out when you get it just out of the box. I expect that to green up over time and for the magenta to be less obvious, but it does make a difference, as we'll see when we look in more detail at some of our test shots. Now, to keep that in perspective, can you color correct it? Of course you can. And there's a substantial price difference. So if you can't afford the C300D Mark II and you're willing to do the color correction, here's an option. Now, in terms of Spectral Similarity Index, SSI, which to me is one of the more useful color quality metrics, the VL300 came in at 71, whereas the Aputure C300D Mark II came in at 76. That's a substantial difference that looks like it's more than just margin of error. And in fact, in some of the shots that I had to grade to get the skin tones just right, it did some other funny things to some of the other background colors, so you may have to do some secondary correction. Whereas the Aputure C300D Mark II has a very advanced Sidus Link Bluetooth mesh app that allows you to do really sophisticated lighting designs when you're using it with other Aputure lights, the VL300 has a very basic app. It mainly allows you to control the dimmer and do a couple of quick presets. Also, the Aputure does have some different effects. You have to decide if those are important to you or not. The VL300 does not have any effects. The VL300 is very much like the first generation Aputure lights, where you had a power brick that goes on the floor, the AC adapter, control box that hangs from the stand, plus the light head. And the newer versions of the Aputures, including the C300 Mark II, has the power brick that normally would have sat on the floor integrated into the control box that goes on the stand. I've actually become really used to the newer Aputure lights. It's really nice to not have that additional box dragging around on the floor when you're repositioning your lights. Again, cost savings, is that worth it to you? It's only something you can answer. I would say there's a slight edge to the VL300 in terms of the internal fan. It doesn't seem to come on quite as often. Hopefully that's going to be okay for the longevity of the LED lights, but it also seems a little bit quieter. That's a really positive thing as far as interfering with sound. Not that the Aputure was a big problem in that area, but if you got it in really close, then it would start to be a problem. And then finally, if you were planning to use any sort of DMX controllers, the VL series from Godox does not have DMX capabilities, whereas the Aputure C300D Mark II does. So if you were just interested in the differences between the two, there's a quick summary of the differences, and if that's all you wanted, you're dismissed. Now let's look at the VL300 in a little bit more detail, focusing on the VL300 at this point. Now, first of all, that price is amazing. For what you get, for $749, I'm really impressed. You get a very high quality light, tons of light output, A really high quality Bowens mount, which allows you to use all different kinds of light modifiers. So you can use this in a variety of situations, a whole bunch of situations. Softbox in this case, you can put on barn doors, you can put on Fresnel lenses, you can put on spotlight lenses, you can do a whole lot with these. Let's take a look at the photometrics here. I used a Seikonic C800 to measure the light both in terms of output and color quality. And you can see, first of all, that the output is tremendous with the reflector. It's actually measuring in almost double of the C300D Mark II. Now, that's if you're just using the included reflector and flooding light everywhere. As soon as you put on some of the other modifiers like the softbox, the Light Dome 2 from Aperture, for example, which conveniently fits this light, basically you're going to be in about the same domain as far as light output. So really good light output. Just to put that in perspective, here, for example, I have the light about 2 meters from me. I have it set to 30% on the dimmer, and we're at f4, ISO 400, 23.976 frames per second, 180-degree shutter angle. So we've got a lot of light to spare here. Now, when it comes to color quality, daylight LED never does quite as well as tungsten-colored LED in the tests that I've done so far. But I think we're still in a decent domain, and this is where the Godox suffers just a little bit. So whereas the C300D Mark II came in at 76 SSI, the Godox came in at 71. Now, what is SSI? Spectral Similarity Index. It is a new metric that was put together by the Academy of Motion Pictures, and what it does essentially is it measures the spectral output of a light compared to a known source. So for example, in this case, we're comparing it to CIE D55, so daylight. And in this case, a score of 71 is not horrible, but it's getting awfully close to the 60s, which is where you can start to see some significant color rendering issues. So it's not, you're seeing what it looks like. We've got some other test shots that we'll show throughout the video here, but it's not perfect. So you are taking a little bit of a hit relative to something like the Aperture C300D Mark II. Now, another area where it struggled a little bit was on its green-magenta balance. This light came in a little bit more magenta. Now, as I mentioned before, that's not necessarily a huge issue because over time, as you get more hours on the LED, it will turn more green. So that magenta issue will start to go away. But it came in at a pretty significant color correction index of 0.4 green, which means you'd essentially have to put almost a half green gel on there to get it balanced on the magenta green balance. So it's a little bit more than I'd like to see. Is it going to mix with other lights? It depends on your other lights. If they're tending green or they're spot on, you might see a little bit of a difference. Build quality-wise, I think we're looking at something very similar to the first generation Aperture lights, if you're familiar with those. So it's made of quality metal and plastics. I think it'll hold up pretty well based on the wear and tear I've put on my Aperture lights over the years. I think this one's going to hold up pretty nicely too. Now, it's not as nice as the newest generation, like the C300D Mark II, which have been really kind of ruggedized in some nice ways, but it still seems like it's going to hold together nicely. Now, one thing I like on the VL series from Godox is that the Bowens mount that they've implemented works really well. In fact, it works better with Aperture's accessories than Aperture lights do. Now, I'm not saying that the Aperture lights are horrible. I'm just saying that I was able to get the light dome on and off and the reflector on and off and all of the other accessories on and off quite a bit easier on the Godox versus the Aperture. The Aperture seemed to have a little bit more play in it. In terms of remote control, you have a couple of options. It comes with a hardware remote, which works fine. Basically, you can choose different channels and groups. Very simple, very straightforward. You also have an app that you can run on your phone, connects via Bluetooth. Again, very simple app, basically for dimming the light, but that's an option as well. Controls are simple and straightforward, and they're basically identical, again, to the first generation Aperture lights. You have a dial to adjust the dimmer on the light, anywhere from 100% down to 1% in 1% increments. So that's good. And you can change the group and the channel for the wireless remote. Now, the control box is interesting because it actually shows a color temperature on it, but it doesn't actually do anything on this particular light. But maybe that means that they will have a bicolor light at some point. Another small difference that I actually didn't mention before is that I don't see a way to force the fan on this. So on the Aperture lights, you have two options. You can force it on all the time or put it in automatic mode, where it will turn itself off if it doesn't need it, turn itself back on automatically when it does need it, based on the thermal design of the overall light. This one, it basically is always in auto mode. So as a soundie, sometimes I wish that you could kind of force it. I'd rather have it on all the time in some cases But it's pretty quiet, as I mentioned before, so not terribly concerned about it. At normal working distances, it's not generally going to be a problem as far as sound is concerned. We did a flicker test here. We dropped the dimmer down to 20% and we ran our camera at the equivalent of 1/785th of a second shutter speed. And what that allowed us to assess is whether or not there was any flicker. Typically, the flicker is going to show up when you dim the light down pretty low. And in our case here, we didn't see any problems with that. You can also power the VL300 with 2 Cine batteries. They're V-mount. And you didn't even need a special battery. Here I have 2 98 watt-hour batteries, and we were able to power it just fine. Now, it's not going to last a long time, but if you do need to get a quick shot somewhere where you don't have power, this is a good way to do that. One thing I should mention about the dimmer as well is that the dimmer is linear. That is to say, when you have it set to 50%, that's half the light output compared to when you have it set to 100%, which is nice as well. Not all lights do that. And of course, the warranty is a 1-year warranty. So let's go ahead and cover some of the cons. Number one is the color quality. The color quality is not horrible. I don't want to overstate this, but I do want to say that relative to the aperture lights that I've measured and many of the other LED lights that I've measured recently, this one is a little bit lower than some of the others. So an SSI of 71 is still very usable, as you can see. However, you may have to do a little bit of color correction in some cases, and you may run into color rendering errors. So if you are doing things that are absolutely color critical, then you probably have a little bit more of a budget, and I would probably recommend going to other lights, something like the Aputure C300D Mark II. Or even better, if you are doing color critical things and you're working in a studio, you have complete control of the lighting in there, I would go with something more like the 300X from Aputure, which allows you to do tungsten colored light, and its SSI is up in the mid-80s, so you're doing a lot better there in terms of color rendering. I'm not a big fan of the AC box that sits on the floor, just in terms of positioning the light or repositioning the light. You kind of have to pick up your C-stand or other light stand, and it's just awkward because there's another thing on the floor that you have to move around. Is it a deal breaker? Really, it's not. For years, I worked with the original Aputure lights that way, and I survived. But it's not as nice as the newer Aputure lights where everything's up in the control box on the stand. And then finally, no DMX in or output. So again, if you need to do DMX control, this is not the light for you. Overall, I think that what Godox has done here is actually a really nice offering for this price point. If you need a powerful light, you don't have a ton for the budget, this is about the least expensive light of this quality that I've seen. Is it perfect? No, it's not perfect. Is it good? Yeah, I'd say it really is. Now, would this be my first choice if I'm doing paid corporate work like I do? And my answer is probably not. Is this something that's going to be good for the enthusiasts that, making self-funded films and things of that nature? I think it could be a good fit in that situation. So there's a look at the Godox VL300. I hope that was helpful for you. If you have any questions, go ahead and leave those down below. And if you've not already subscribed, make sure you do that. And we'll be sure to get you more great videos on how to improve your lighting and sound for video. Talk to you soon. And there's a toilet flushing, just so you know what that sounds like.